Have you ever had a moment where everything went quiet for a second and the thoughts slipped in uninvited? How did I become this person? And do I even recognize them? It can happen in the most ordinary places, alone in your room after a long day, staring at your reflection in a dark phone screen, or sitting beside someone who knows your name but not your inner world. Outwardly, life keeps moving. Inwardly, something fractures. You realize you've been living, speaking, choosing, loving as someone you learned to be, not someone you discovered. You move through your days wearing a face that fits well enough. You laugh when expected, agree when disagreement feels dangerous, stay strong when your hands are shaking. People describe you with words that sound accurate, reliable, calm, successful, kind, but none of them quite feel like you. Somewhere along the way, the question, "Who am I?" was quietly replaced with, "Who do I need to be to survive?" And you answered it so well that even you forgot it was ever a performance. There is a particular loneliness that comes from this kind of existence. It isn't the loneliness of being alone, it's the loneliness of being unseen while surrounded. You can be in a relationship and still feel like a ghost. You can be applauded and still feel hollow. Psychology calls this a split between the authentic self and the constructed self, a fracture often formed in early attachment, when love felt conditional and safety depended on adaptation. Neuroscience would tell you your brain learned efficiency, how to minimize rejection, how to secure belonging, how to avoid emotional threat, but no scan can fully capture the ache of realizing you've been successful at everything except being real. Sometimes the realization arrives through a small story, a child who learned to stay quiet because silence kept the peace, an adult who learned to smile because sadness made others uncomfortable, a relationship where you shrink your needs so the connection doesn't break. You become a garden that looks alive from a distance, green and orderly, while the soil beneath is dry from years without water. You convince yourself this is normal. Everyone feels this way, you think. Everyone compromises. Everyone wears masks. And maybe they do, but not everyone wakes up one day and feels like a stranger in their own life. The most unsettling truth is that you can build an entire future from this place of not knowing yourself, and it can look like success from the outside, but inside, something waits. A shadow you keep outrunning, a voice you keep postponing, a question that grows heavier with time. If I stripped away the roles, the expectations, the survival strategies, who would remain? That question is not gentle. It does not arrive to comfort you. It arrives to confront you, and the moment you finally allow it to linger, the journey backward to where this forgetting first began quietly begins to open. Have you ever wondered where you first learned that being yourself was risky? Long before you had language for identity or fear, your nervous system was already taking notes. As a child, you didn't analyze your environment, you absorbed it. A raised voice became danger. A withdrawn parent became uncertainty. Praise became safety. Silence became survival. In those early rooms with their soft light and invisible tensions, something inside you began learning a quiet, devastating lesson. Love can be earned, but it is not guaranteed. You may remember a moment that felt small at the time. You cried too loudly. You asked too many questions. You showed excitement when it was inconvenient, and the room changed. A sigh, a look, a parent who was suddenly tired, distracted, or cold. No one said, "Stop being yourself," but the message landed anyway. Attachment theory tells us that children mold their emotional expression around the availability of care. When love feels conditional, the child adapts. When affection is inconsistent, the child becomes strategic. You learned, not consciously but instinctively, which parts of you were welcomed and which were quietly exiled. So you adjusted. You became the easy child, the funny one, the quiet one, the responsible one. You learned to read the emotional weather before speaking. Your curiosity slowly shifted inward, away from the question, "Who am I?" and toward the safer question, "What keeps me accepted?" The garden of your identity still grew, but only in directions that didn't threaten the fragile climate around you. Other parts withered without water, unnoticed except for a faint ache you couldn't yet name. Neuroscience would describe this as a developing brain wiring itself for survival. The amygdala learned what to fear. The reward system learned what earned approval. The prefrontal cortex learned how to edit you in real time. But what science cannot fully capture is the loneliness of being a child who feels responsible for the emotional temperature of the room. You were never told this was your job, yet you carried it anyway. Years later, you might recognize the pattern in a relationship. You shrink your needs. You anticipate moods. You apologize for feelings before they're even expressed. The child is still there, performing the same ancient negotiation. If I become what you need, will you stay? And somewhere beneath that performance, resentment grows like an underground river. You don't resent your parents as much as you resent the quiet self you had to leave behind to survive. The tragedy is not that you adapted. The tragedy is that the adaptation worked so well, it became your identity. You learned who to be before you ever had the chance to discover who you were. And when a child practices abandonment long enough, it feels like normal life. It is only later, standing in the echo of that early training, that you begin to sense the shadow of the self you once were. And that recognition, heavy and aching, becomes the bridge between the child who learned to adapt and the adult who now lives by performing that adaptation every day. Have you ever noticed how effortlessly you step into certain roles, as if your life were a stage and the costume was stitched into your skin? In one room, you are the reliable one, steady and uncomplaining. In another, the entertainer, quick with humor to keep the air light. With certain people, you become small and agreeable. With others, endlessly competent. The shift happens so fast you barely feel it. This is not personality in its pure form. This is choreography. This is the mask learned so early that you now mistake it for your face. You see it in the people pleaser who cannot rest unless everyone around them is calm. You see it in the overachiever who feels valuable only when exhausted. You see it in the silent sufferer who turns pain into politeness, and in the caretaker who pours endlessly into others while quietly starving. These are not random traits. They are survival strategies that grew a nervous system around them. Attachment patterns planted the seeds, conditioning gave them shape, and repetition turned them into identity. You don't wake up every morning and decide to perform. You simply perform the way lungs breathe. There is a quiet cost to this invisibility. You find yourself laughing at jokes that bruise you, agreeing to plans that drain you, holding back words that might change the shape of your life. An adult version of that same child still scans the room, still reads the weather, still edits the self in real time. In relationships, you become what is wanted. At work, you become what is rewarded. And in solitude, when the noise fades, you sometimes realize you don't know what you want at all. The garden looks full, but the soil beneath is dry. Neuroscience would say your brain is conserving energy by relying on familiar patterns. The prefrontal cortex delegates to old emotional scripts. The limbic system whispers warnings long before conscious thought can intervene. Studies on identity formation show that what is practiced becomes who we think we are. But the deeper truth is more unsettling. The longer you live through a mask, the more the shadow grows restless behind it. And the shadow is not evil. It is simply everything you were never allowed to be. You tell yourself you know who you are. You point to habits, achievements, adjectives, but what you often know is the training, not the truth. You know how to be useful. You know how to be liked. You know how to be needed. What you may not know is how to be unguarded. Fear lingers in the background like a low, constant hum. Fear of rejection if the mask slips. Fear of emptiness if it comes off completely. Resentment seeps in quietly too, not always toward others, but toward yourself for the life you keep postponing. And yet, the most haunting part is this. The mask did not form to deceive the world. It formed to protect you. It kept you connected. It kept you safe. It helped you survive the rooms where the true self once felt unwelcome. But now, standing inside an adulthood built from these performances, a new question begins to pulse beneath everything you do. If this personality was built for survival, not for truth, then what unseen machinery in your mind is still building it today? Have you ever wondered why, even when you promise yourself to finally be honest. Something inside you tightens and quietly pulls you back into old patterns. It feels like hesitation, but it's older than doubt. Long before you had language for identity, your brain learned a single brutal equation: safety first, truth later. What you now experience as personality is, in many ways, the memory of what once kept you emotionally alive. Psychology calls this ego, not as arrogance, but as the part of the mind built to negotiate the world without overwhelming the nervous system. As a child, your identity did not form through free exploration. It formed through feedback. Warmth meant continue. Disapproval meant retreat. Attachment theory explains how your early bonds trained your emotional expectations long before you ever chose them. If closeness felt unpredictable, you learned control. If love felt conditional, you learned performance. If silence meant danger, you learned anticipation. The self did not expand. It learned how to fold itself small enough to survive. Neuroscience deepens the picture. The default mode network, the quiet orchestra of the brain that runs when you are not actively focused, is constantly narrating who you are, what you mean, and how you belong. It doesn't ask whether the story is true. It asks whether the story keeps you connected. Emotional suppression becomes a reflex, not a decision. The amygdala flags threat faster than consciousness can intervene, and the body reacts before the mind can question. By the time you say, "That's just how I am," the pattern has already chosen itself for you. You can see this at work in small private moments. An adult, you hesitate before sending a vulnerable message, then delete it for something safer. A relationship where you feel the monster within stir when you want to speak your need, only to feel the familiar mask slide back into place. A quiet evening where you feel restless without knowing why, pacing like a shadow trapped behind glass. The brain interprets authenticity as risk when it was once punished, and it responds with ancient alarms you mistake for intuition. Studies show that most of human behavior is driven by unconscious automation rather than deliberate choice. You believe you are choosing, but much of the choosing has already been decided by circuits shaped in childhood rooms you no longer remember clearly. The garden of your identity grows along the grooves carved by early fear. When you try to plant something new, the soil resists with a memory older than language. And yet, there is a strange mercy in this design. The brain did not hide your true self out of cruelty. It hid it out of loyalty to your survival. It chose belonging over authenticity because, once, belonging meant life. But what once kept you safe can later become the cage that holds you apart from yourself. And as you begin to understand the machinery beneath your mask, another question quietly rises from the dark. If the mind learned to protect you by hiding the self, what happens when that protection turns into the very source of your deepest suffering? Have you ever felt the strange sting of watching your own life unfold in ways you never consciously chose, as if some unseen hand were steering you away from yourself while you politely looked the other way? This is the quiet violence of self-ignorance. It does not arrive as disaster. It arrives as tolerance. You stay in rooms that bruise you. You soften your boundaries until they dissolve. You accept words that diminish you because confrontation feels more dangerous than disappearance. And each time you do, a small fracture spreads through your inner world. You can see it in the relationship where you slowly shrink. At first, it feels like compromise. Then it feels like survival. You excuse coldness as misunderstanding, disrespect as stress, absence as independence. The shadow watches silently as you learn to accept what you once swore you never would. The monster within is not rage. It is the ache that grows when you betray your own emotional truth for the promise of proximity. Loneliness deepens not because you are alone, but because the version of you that longs to be seen is no longer allowed to speak. You see the same pattern in choice after choice that does not align with your values. You pursue careers that drain you because they look respectable from the outside. You adopt beliefs that keep the peace even when they suffocate your doubts. You live out expectations that were inherited, never examined. Identity becomes a script handed down rather than a life discovered. And beneath the surface, an unnamed grief follows you through every success, like a shadow that grows longer as the light fades. Psychology describes this as fragmentation, when the self splits to survive competing emotional demands. Parts of you hold anger you were never allowed to express. Parts of you contain longing you were taught to ignore. Parts of you carry fear that cannot yet be spoken. Neuroscience would say suppressed emotion does not disappear. It relocates into tension, addiction, numbness, or unexplained despair. The garden still grows, but the roots have twisted underground in the dark, starving for what they were denied. There is a particular emptiness that forms when you live far from your own center. It does not scream, it hums. It sounds like restlessness at night, like irritation with strangers, like boredom that no achievement can soothe. You begin to feel haunted not by ghosts of the past, but by the life you never stepped into. Every time you avoid yourself, the pain does not disappear. It waits, and the paradox is cruel. The more you run from who you are, the louder that absence begins to knock from within. Yet this suffering remains largely invisible to the world. From the outside, you may look composed, successful, even admirable. Inside, the shadow keeps record, and as the conflict between who you are and who you live as grows heavier with time, another question begins to loom beneath all the noise. If avoiding yourself is this painful, why does the world so often reward you for continuing to do it? Have you ever noticed how quickly the world rushes in the moment you turn quiet, how silence itself now feels suspicious, as if stillness were a flaw that must be corrected? You live inside a culture that rarely asks who you are, only what you produce, display, achieve, and upgrade. From the time you are young, the message is subtle but relentless. Become valuable, become visible, become impressive. And slowly, the mirror of your worth is moved from the inside of your chest to the glowing screens and measuring systems outside of you. You see this conditioning begin early. A child learns that praise is loudest for performance, not for presence. A drawing is admired for its neatness, not for its feeling. A grade becomes more important than curiosity, and the quiet, inward question of identity is replaced with louder external goals. Later, as an adult, the pattern sharpens. You are trained to curate yourself, to edit your life into an image that can be consumed. Social media becomes a hall of mirrors where everyone performs confidence, happiness, ambition, while quietly measuring themselves against illusions. The mask is no longer just emotional, it becomes public. Relationships too are scripted. You are taught what love should look like, how quickly it should move, what milestones mean success. You measure connection in optics rather than depth. You stay in unsatisfying bonds because they look right from the outside. You chase chemistry because it photographs well, not because it feeds your nervous system. Attachment styles play beneath the surface. Anxious hearts craving constant validation, avoidant souls hiding behind independence, while algorithms reward whatever keeps you scrolling instead of feeling. Philosophers once warned that a society obsessed with appearance would lose contact with essence, and now you live inside that warning. Productivity culture turns exhaustion into a badge of honor. Success myths promise fulfillment through accumulation, yet quietly postpone peace indefinitely. You are taught to fear emptiness, to fear boredom, to fear stillness itself, because in stillness, the shadow begins to speak. The garden without water begins to reveal its dryness. The monster within, not cruel but untreated, starts to stir. None of this is accidental. A distracted self is a manageable self. A fragmented identity is a profitable identity. When you do not know who you are easier to target, to motivate through status, through comparison, through fear of falling behind. Your longing is redirected outward, your uncertainty turned into consumption, your restlessness sold back to you as the next solution. Self-ignorance becomes not only tolerated, but engineered. And yet, in quiet moments, when the noise fades and the performance loses its voice, a strange fatigue settles in. You feel tired not just in the body, but in the soul. You sense that something essential has been postponed too many times. You realize that being rewarded by the world has not made you feel more real, only more distant from yourself. and as the pressure to perform tightens around your identity like an invisible costume, another truth begins to surface beneath the lighting and applause. A life built entirely on external validation eventually collects an internal cost that no one else can see, but you will feel it everywhere. Have you ever felt exhausted in a way that sleep never touches? A heaviness that settles deeper than the body and lingers behind the eyes even on your best days? This is not the tiredness of effort. It is the fatigue of existing at a distance from yourself. When you live as a character long enough, the world may know your voice, your habits, your roles, but it never quite meets you. And slowly, you begin to feel the same distance from your own life. Anxiety becomes your unwanted companion, but it rarely announces what it wants. It arrives without a clear cause, a tightness in the chest during quiet moments, a restless ache in the stomach when the world finally goes silent. You try to trace it to work, to relationships, to the future, but beneath all those surface fears is a deeper one you've never been taught how to name. The fear that you are disappearing behind the mask that once kept you safe. Neuroscience would say your nervous system is stuck in low-grade survival mode, constantly scanning for threat even when none is visible. But subjectively, it simply feels like you can never fully rest. You may recognize this loneliness in the middle of connection itself. You sit across from someone who says they love you, and yet something in you feels untouched. You laugh together, plan together, even grow together, and still a quiet grief hums beneath it all. Because you are not entirely there. The attachment bond exists, but the self that longs to be known remains hidden behind careful responses and practiced emotions. You become seen as a role rather than a presence, and being needed is mistaken for being known. Burnout creeps in not only from overwork, but from the labor of constant self-editing. The people pleaser grows tired of pleasing. The caretaker feels emptied by endless giving. The overachiever reaches goals that feel strangely hollow. Identity confusion thickens as you move from one version of yourself to another, without ever arriving anywhere that feels like home. The garden looks lush from the outside, yet the soil inside is cracked from thirst. There is a specific grief that arrives when you finally glimpse how long you have lived this way. It does not explode, it sinks. You mourn the conversations you never had, the boundaries you never held, the fire you learned to dim before it ever frightened anyone. You grieve the person you might have been if safety had not felt like a performance. The shadow does not accuse you, it simply stands beside you, holding the quiet record of all that was postponed. And yet, even inside this emotional collapse, something fragile begins to stir. When the character finally grows too heavy to carry, when the loneliness of being unseen feels worse than the fear of being revealed, a strange opening appears. The collapse does not only mark an ending, it marks a threshold. For the first time, the pain itself begins to ask a different question, one that does not seek escape, but return. What would it mean to rebuild a life not from survival, but from truth? What if the only reason you have not yet met your true self is because you were never taught how to stay when discomfort appears? The instinct to run is ancient, wired into a nervous system that once equated vulnerability with danger. Yet the path back to yourself does not begin with force or reinvention. It begins with the far quieter act of noticing. The moment you pause instead of numbing, scrolling, distracting, or performing, something unfamiliar rises to the surface. At first it feels like restlessness, then like grief, then like a presence you've not felt in years. This is the beginning of self-revelation. You start by learning how to observe your emotions without immediately obeying or suppressing them. A wave of anger comes, and instead of turning it into silence or explosion, you let it speak internally. A tightening in your chest arrives, and instead of fleeing into noise, you remain. Neuroscience shows that naming and witnessing feelings calms the threat centers of the brain and restores balance between emotion and reason. But subjectively, it feels like standing still while an old storm passes through you. The shadow does not vanish when you look at it. It softens. The monster within shrinks when it no longer has to hide in the dark. At times, you may return to the child you once were through writing or memory, not to relive suffering, but to listen for what was interrupted. Journaling becomes less about documenting days and more about uncovering buried truths. You write not to be productive, but to be honest. You notice patterns in relationships, in fear, in exhaustion, and slowly you stop calling them just how you are. You begin to recognize them as protective reflexes that once served a purpose, but now ask to be released. Boundaries emerge not as walls, but as acts of self-recognition. You learn that saying no is not rejection, it is identification. You learn that silence is not emptiness, but a doorway. In quiet moments, free from performance and demand, your values start to surface, not the ones you inherited or were praised for, but the ones that quietly ache for expression. The garden, long deprived of water, begins to respond when you finally tend the soil instead of the appearance. Healing here does not feel like becoming someone new. It feels disorienting precisely because it is a return. You are not building an identity from scratch. You are remembering what was set aside. The relief is subtle at first, mixed with fear. There is grief for the years spent running. There is resentment toward the world that taught you to hide. Yet beneath it all, there is an unfamiliar steadiness that does not come from approval, achievement, or being needed. And one evening, perhaps in the stillness after a long day, you may notice a shift that cannot be measured. The room feels quieter, not because the world has changed, but because your inner life is no longer in constant flight. The mask loosens, the shadow no longer screams for attention, and as you stand in the space where survival once ruled, another question begins to stir with a new kind of gravity. When all the roles finally fall away, what timeless truth about who you are remains beneath them? What if the greatest distance you will ever travel is not across countries or careers or relationships, but inward toward the quiet center you have spent your life avoiding? You can cross oceans and still outrun yourself. You can change names, homes, roles, and lovers, yet carry the same unasked questions like invisible luggage. The world teaches you how to move forward, how to upgrade, how to accumulate, but it rarely teaches you how to arrive. And so you learn motion without meeting, progress without presence. There is a particular fear that rises when you stand at the doorway of your own inner life. It is not the fear of danger, it is the fear of truth. To meet yourself is to meet everything you postponed. The child who waited to be chosen, the anger you learned to swallow, the longing you disguised as ambition, the tenderness you armored with indifference. It is easier to battle the world than to sit still with the shadow that knows your real name. The monster within feels terrifying not because it is evil, but because it carries what you were never taught how to hold. You may notice this fear in small moments, an adult who keeps the room loud so silence cannot ask questions, a relationship where distance feels safer than intimacy, a night when exhaustion pulls you toward reflection, but distraction wins again. Neuroscience would tell you the brain prefers the familiar over the true. Philosophy would remind you that avoidance does not dissolve being. It fragments it, and slowly the mask hardens into a second skin you forget how to remove. Yet beneath all the fear, there is another truth that rarely gets spoken. The loneliness you feel is not always for other people. Sometimes it is for yourself. Sometimes what aches inside you is not the absence of companionship, but the absence of presence. You have been living near your life, adjacent to your own breath, watching yourself from a distance as if you were someone else. The garden still waits for water. The shadow still waits to be seen. The self still waits to be met. Courage in this sense is not loud. It does not announce itself with conquest or confidence. It appears quietly, in moments when you stop running and let your nervous system feel what it has been bracing against for years. When you sit with discomfort long enough for it to transform into understanding. When you choose awareness over anesthesia. This is not self-improvement. This is self-encounter. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: you cannot escape a self you have never met. You can only postpone the meeting. The world will give you endless corridors to wander, endless roles to perform, endless mirrors that reflect someone useful and acceptable and successful. But one day, in the stillness between distractions, a different mirror will appear. It will not ask who you are to the world. It will ask who you are to yourself. And the answer, whatever it is, will not arrive as a conclusion, but as a beginning that cannot be unbegun.